Cuba, communist haven, known for its scenic beaches and wonderful political leaders who definitely don't do anything questionable to their own people. It's a place so wonderful that some 500,000 people have fled in the last 3 years alone. Yep, it's just that good. And let's not leave out the charming infrastructure, with buildings crumbling faster than your New Year's resolutions. It's like living in a history museum. Albeit it's incredibly broken and very quickly devolving, but it's still a history museum, so hey. Anyways, who doesn't love waiting in lines? In Cuba, standing in line for basic necessities is practically a national sport. Bread today, maybe milk tomorrow, and if you're really lucky, you just might get toilet paper by next week. For entertainment, state-run TV has all the excitement of a 90s infomercial marathon. Of course, let's not forget the classic cars. Cuba's got plenty of them, because they haven't been able to import new ones since the 50s. So it's like living in a vintage car show every single day. But hey, at least the beaches are nice. Just don't mind having critical shortages of literally everything you need for everyday necessities. But today, though, let's discuss a possible reality where none of that is the case. To probably understand this timeline that we're going to envision, however, we're going to have to take a look at what actually happened in the real world. So let's take a step back. The year's 1898, and America, with minimal prep and honestly looking like a hungover mess the entire time, absolutely curb-stomped Spain in the Spanish-American War. They signed the Treaty of Paris. Not that one, or that one, or that. Okay, there's 31 of these things. It takes a minute to find it. Okay, that one. Anyways, in the treaty, the US walks away with Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Spain, on the other hand, walks away with yeah, they got jack shit. Maybe don't touch the boats and you don't lose your decrepit-ass empire, alright? Okay, alright, let's go on. Now, Cuba, on the other hand, was a whole different story from the other territories. Rather than being annexed by the US, Cuba was made a protectorate in 1902. This means they, quote-unquote, kept their independence, but the US held a lot of influence over their affairs. This led to a series of puppet governments in Cuba and a massive amount of instability for the next 5 decades. Fast forward to 1959, Fidel Castro overthrows the government, Cuba becomes a communist state, and with the US not too thrilled about having a communist neighbor 90 miles off their southern coast, responds with the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Cuban Missile Crisis ensues, and is followed by just decades of US embargoes. It's kind of like the Mr. Bones wild ride of geopolitics, if you will. And so now that we've gotten through actual history, let's do what I imagine you're actually here to do, and let's go back in time yet again and imagine what could have been if the US had just simply annexed Cuba in the Treaty of Paris. Tiny little quick disclaimer, this is just my own interpretation of how this would have gone down based on what I know about certain things and people in history, so if you think it would have happened any differently, by all means, fire off, doesn't matter. Anyways, the Spanish-American War happens and the Treaty of Paris is signed. Everything's still the same, but now with one notable exception. Included on the list of annexed territories is Cuba. So instead of using puppet governments with, ruthless dictators to develop Cuba like in our timeline, in this timeline, they just cut out the middleman and run the show themselves. The US, that is. So enter one William and he got shot dead before he could actually get things going. Okay, let's retry that. Enter one Theodore Roosevelt, one of history's main protagonists and avid expansionist of American imperialism. In this timeline, Roosevelt's administration takes an aggressive approach to integrate Cuba, kicking off a series of bold actions to sort of fast-track it to statehood. First up on the docket is infrastructure. Recognizing the need for a strong foundation, Roosevelt directs massive federal funding into Cuba's infrastructure, transforming Havana into something like a tropical New York City of sorts. Railways expand, linking rural areas to urban markets. New housing projects in Havana and Santiago improve living conditions, and comprehensive upgrades ensure reliable utilities. Schools and hospitals are rapidly built, equipped with the latest technology and staffed by trained professionals. Modern farming techniques and industrial zones boost productivity and create jobs. Ports in Havana and Santiago are expanded, facilitating increased trade, while telecommunications infrastructure improves communication around the island and with the outside world. Large-scale public works projects would create jobs and improve living standards, and the Cuban economy would ultimately start to boom, thanks primarily to a numerous amount of mainland investments in agriculture, manufacturing, and specifically tourism. All of this would not simply just be to boost the Cuban economy and living standards, but ultimately have a political end, and that being to further strengthen pro-American sentiments among the Cuban people. But it's not just about rock and stone. Huh? Anyone? No? Okay, I'll do the low-tier god thing. Anyways, Roosevelt's administration would establish a robust territorial government in Cuba, which would mirror U.S. state structures. Political reforms are introduced to stabilize the region and promote democratic processes. Education programs would very quickly get to work promoting the English language and American civic values. God, that is a tongue twister. A territorial governor would be appointed and made responsible for implementing federal policies and ensuring smooth operation of the territorial government. And I'm going to do a little something here where I go on a tangent. Okay. I like to go into politics like this just because the structures are interesting. Anyways, Cuba's territorial government would include a bicameral legislative assembly, so this is pretty much just Congress, but for a territory. It would consist of an upper chamber, so a Senate, and then a lower chamber, the House of Representatives, and members would be elected by the Cuban populace, ensuring representation of local interests. All laws, of course, these would have to be in line with already established federal laws because it's a federal territory and thus would be subject to review by Congress. All right, end of tangent. All right, so regular elections are held to elect members of the Legislative Assembly and local officials. These elections are designed to promote democratic participation and further educate the Cuban people on the functions of American democracy. Cuba would also send a non-voting delegate to the U.S. House of Representatives, and this is similar to what DC has, or what Puerto Rico has, I think is a better example in our timeline. But anyways, this delegate represents Cuban interests in Congress, advocating for federal support and resources. So with the politics squared away, next on the agenda, economic integration. With favorable trade policies, Cuban sugar, tobacco, and rum start flowing into the U.S. These commodities become highly sought after in American markets, leading to a significant boost in trade volume between the two regions. American businesses quickly recognize the potential and invest heavily in Cuban agriculture, transforming the landscape with modern farming techniques and increasing productivity. Tourism also flourishes as American tourists are drawn to Cuba's pristine beaches, vibrant culture, and historic cities. Havana in particular becomes a major tourist destination with new hotels, resorts, and casinos being developed to cater to the influx of visitors. And this boom in tourism not only brings in foreign capital, but also creates numerous jobs for local Cubans, further integrating the economy with that of the mainland U.S. The economic growth in Cuba would lead to an improvement in the standard of living for many Cubans. New businesses emerge, benefiting from the increased demand and investment. The infrastructure improvements, combined with a stable political environment, make Cuba an attractive destination for both tourists and investors. And of course, what's a Roosevelt plan without some military shenanigans? Recognizing Cuba's strategic location, the U.S. establishes key military bases, ensuring a strong presence in the Caribbean. These bases create jobs, integrating the Cuban workforce, and serve as training grounds for the Navy and Marine Corps. The proximity to the Panama Canal as well allows rapid deployment of forces, reinforcing national security and further bolstering the Monroe Doctrine. The presence of U.S. military personnel fosters cultural exchange and ultimately strengthens bilateral relations. And with all this development, statehood advocacy groups start to gain momentum, supported by early referendums showing strong support. By the end of Roosevelt's presidency, the groundwork for Cuban statehood is rather solidly laid out. So now you might be wondering, well, what about Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines? We've been talking about Cuba all day, but what about, the other territories that in our timeline actually, get included within U.S. territory? All right, well, let's start with Puerto Rico. They're going to try and follow a similar path inspired by Cuba, with statehood movements springing up, but they struggled to really gain any traction simply because of Puerto Rico's size and population. Guam would just remain a strategic military outpost in the Pacific, and the Philippines would just continue their journey towards self-governance, and, significant investments would still be flowing in for infrastructure and governance, much like they did in our own timeline. And then there's Hawaii. Seeing rapid progress in Cuba, Hawaii's statehood movements start to get a boost a little bit earlier than they would in our timeline, and political groups would leverage the Cuban example, and Hawaii's path to statehood would ultimately accelerate and potentially becomes a state a few years earlier than its historical 1959 date. Hawaii's strategic importance and economic potential ensure it remains a priority, so the investments that, or at least the rate of investments that they receive in our timeline, remains consistent in this one as well. So after 30 years of investments and development, in 1928, Cuba becomes the 49th state of the United States. Federal investments continue, boosting tourism, agriculture, and the economy. Cuba's fertile land supports major exports like sugar, tobacco, and coffee. During Prohibition, Cuba's nightlife actually ends up thriving as Americans seek alcohol, which bolsters the local economy and greatly expands the hospitality industry. However, the Great Depression hits in 1929, halting economic growth. Demand for Cuban exports plummets, and tourism obviously declines along with it. The New Deal programs later provide some relief, creating few jobs and stimulating economic activity through public works projects. Crop diversification and agricultural cooperatives help stabilize the agricultural sector. With the end of Prohibition in 1933, tourism slowly begins to rebound, and by the late 1930s, Cuba's economy begins to stabilize, with increasing demand for agricultural products and renewed tourism growth. Labor movements gain momentum, leading to improved wages and working conditions influenced by New Deal policies. Cultural vibrancy flourishes, with Havana becoming a center for jazz, salsa, and other musical genres. World War II further boosts the economy, with the U.S. increasing its military presence, which, expands the bases and the shipyards, and constructs a plethora of military airfields. Cuban farms and factories also finally begin to once again operate at full capacity to support the war effort, creating a massive amount of jobs and greatly reducing unemployment. The Cuban government promotes patriotic sentiment, galvanizing the population's commitment to the war effort as well. And now the part you've probably been waiting for. As World War II comes to an end and tensions between the US and the Soviet Union escalate, Cuba's strategic location makes it a frontline state in the Cold War. The US expands and modernizes its military bases on the island, including naval and air facilities, to ensure rapid deployment capabilities and robust defense systems. Cuba becomes a crucial hub for surveillance and intelligence operations in the Caribbean and Latin America. U.S. intelligence agencies establish significant operations on the island to monitor Soviet activities and influence throughout the region. As Cuba is a U.S. state, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 simply does not occur. In fact, no real crisis would actually occur in the Western Hemisphere. The strategic U.S. military presence on the island, as well as having no real political partners in the region, deters Soviet attempts to establish missile bases in the Western Hemisphere. This in turn would keep U.S. Jupiter missiles in Turkey until disarmament treaties later on during the late 70s and 80s. The state would experience continued industrial growth with a focus on high-tech industries, manufacturing, and pharmaceuticals. And of course, the tourism industry would continue to flourish, with Cuba's beaches, culture, and historic sites drawing millions of visitors annually. Havana would quickly become this timeline's version of Miami. The 1960s and 1970s see a cultural renaissance in Cuba. Music, film, literature, and the arts thrive, with Cuban artists gaining international acclaim. Cultural festivals and events attract global attention, solidifying Cuba's reputation as a cultural hub. As we get into the 80s, we would see a rather noticeable shift in Cuban economics. This would be because of a little something known as Reaganomics. The presidency of Ronald Reagan would be the most influential on Cuban society since the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. Tax cuts, deregulation, and reducing government spending. These are all policies that would impact Cuba by potentially reducing federal aid and social programs. However, tax cuts and deregulation would also potentially stimulate private investment in Cuban businesses, particularly in tourism, agriculture, and manufacturing, which are more or less the core three to Cuba's economy. The focus on free market policies would also likely exacerbate economic disparities. Wealthier regions and industries in Cuba would most likely thrive, while poorer communities would most likely struggle. It's Reagan's war on drugs, though, that has the most profound effect on Cuba. Increased law enforcement and harsh sentencing for drug-related offenses lead to higher incarceration rates, which disproportionately affect a rather high minority population percentage in Cuba. This results in heightened racial tensions and feelings of marginalization among Cuba's rather diverse population. In response, cultural and social movements gain quite a bit of strength. Minority rights are more heavily advocated for, and this leads to rather significant activism within the state. And the state itself would become a hub for more progressive and left-leaning thinkers, with increased efforts to address social inequalities and promote civil rights. Despite the challenges, though, Cuba's private sector experiences rather significant growth due to increased investment and entrepreneurial activities under Reaganomics' emphasis on free trade. Small businesses in tourism and agriculture would actually thrive under the deregulated conditions. Additionally, Cuba becomes a hub for technology, attracting a lot of startups and a number of tech companies. The state government supports this growth through targeted incentives and infrastructure investments. Another thing to note as well is the effect Reagan's presidency would have on the drug trade and how that would affect Cuba as a state. This harkens back to the war on drugs piece. And this part could have its own video, but this one is already running quite a bit longer than I intended it to, so let's shorten this down as best we can. Cuba's strategic location is a key point in drug trafficking routes. That is not just in this timeline, that's in our own as well. Remember how I said Havana became the Miami of this timeline? I mean, it became the Miami of this timeline. Anyways, so it's like I said earlier, the crime rates go up, so the law enforcement gets harsher. But to sort of wrap up this bit, ultimately, the drug trade would just create a very complex issue in Cuba, and like I said, this would warrant its own video entirely, but that's not, again, what we're here to talk about. But as the 80s wind down, we reach the 90s and beyond, and if I'm being completely honest, I gave a lot of thought to this segment, but at the end of the day, when you're trying to make this as realistic yet entertaining as you can, I was pretty stumped as to what this would actually look like in this version of Cuba. If I had to take any guess, it would be something akin to like an island version of Florida, you know, so like coastal Florida, not the swamplands and all that. That's a that's a whole different thing. Anyways, as Cuba navigates the complexities of the late 20th century and it gets into the 21st, it continues to evolve, and ultimately it just looks a lot like any other U.S. state. It has strategic and economic importance, and it has a cultural vibrancy that defines its own unique role and maintains it as an influential part of the United States. Once again, this is all merely speculation. I know, cue the LTG. But that is sort of the point of all this, so if you disagree with any of the points here, I mean, have at it. You know, the goal is to have a discussion. Again, this is all just a hypothetical, so maybe there's an element that I overlooked or I didn't give enough attention to, but, you know, in any case, we've reached the end. And if you've made it this far, thanks for sticking around and listening to my grand illusions. If you enjoyed it, feel free to like, share, and, you know, subscribe, maybe, if you want to do that sort of thing. If you don't, that's alright too, I guess. But either way, until next time.